Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise, take a stack of dense sources, and pull out the most essential, fascinating insights you need to be deeply informed. Today, we're embarking on a journey into the heart of a philosophical crisis. We're tackling a concept known globally as the problem of divine absence. Now, typically when we discuss this, our minds go straight to Western theology.
Right, the classic problem of evil.
Exactly. The logical conundrum of immense suffering coupled with an all-powerful, all-loving God who, well, seems to be nowhere to be found. But that core tension, that feeling of expectation colliding with just silence, that's a universal human experience.
And that universality is our target today. We're deliberately stepping outside that well-worn Anglo-American theological path. We're turning the clock way back over 2 millennia to the tumultuous warring states period of China. Our mission is to understand how the great 4th century BC Confucian philosopher Mencius navigated this exact dilemma. I mean, he was faced with utter societal collapse, widespread horror, and yet he maintained this belief in a powerful, caring spiritual force he called heaven, or Tian.
So we're using a non-Western lens.
We're using it to ask, if an agent, a moral, powerful, and invested agent exists, why is its intervention conspicuously absent when it is most needed?
That immediately frames the problem in a new light. But before we plunge into Mencius's world, let's clarify the philosophical terms we're using. Because absence and hiddenness get conflated all the time, but they're critically distinct, especially in contemporary scholarship.
That distinction is absolutely key. Philosophers like John Schellenberg, for example, they define the problem of divine hiddenness primarily as a propositional problem.
Meaning?
It's about the theoretical argument, the idea that a perfectly loving God would ensure there's enough evidence for every non-resistant person to form a belief that God exists. It's very focused on belief, faith, and the nature of evidence.
So it's highly intellectual. It's focused on whether a rational person could fail to believe if God were truly loving and accessible.
Exactly. The problem of divine absence, on the other hand, is the experiential version of that struggle, and it's often dramatically amplified. It doesn't primarily challenge logical proof of God.
No, it challenges your day-to-day reality.
Yes. It's about the concrete, sensory experience of interacting or trying to interact with a divine agent. It crystallizes because, first, a devout person expects the divine to be actively present, yet second, they experience the divine as just, silent, unresponsive, absent during the most critical times. And scholars like Nagasawa, they point out that absence often combines the worst elements of hiddenness and the problem of evil. You have immense suffering right alongside this deafening spiritual silence.
Wow.
But crucially, the problem of absence, and this is why Mencius is such a perfect case study, it doesn't require the concept of an omnigod, one who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. That's often the stumbling block in Western discussions.
And that's the philosophical bridge we need. So by looking at a tradition like the Mencian one, where the divine agent, Tian, is powerful and benevolent, but not necessarily omnipotent in the Western sense, we can test the universality of this crisis.
We can.
Are the emotional and intellectual struggles the same, regardless of the divine agent's specific attributes?
That is precisely the mission. By analyzing classical Chinese philosophy, we are adding a crucial non-Western voice to a conversation that's been, frankly, dominated by Anglo-American assumptions. It lets us raise these profound questions. Does the experience of divine silence lead to the same crisis of commitment everywhere? And maybe. Are our current definitions of divine love and care a bit too colored by Western ideas of, say, constant availability?
Okay, so let's anchor ourselves in history. To really understand Mencius's crisis of expectation, we first have to get our heads around the reality of his life. This was the Warring States period, roughly the 4th century BC. This was not a time for detached reflection.
No, not at all. It was, quite literally hell on earth. Mencius lived during a time of just ceaseless conflict where states were constantly fighting for supremacy.
And what did that actually mean for the people on the ground?
It meant, well, one scholar describes the result as the larger states were just annexing the smaller ones. And that wasn't just, a change of government.
Yeah, it's devastation.
Complete devastation, mass casualties, social disruption, and the total collapse of the agricultural base they needed just to survive.
And this wasn't abstract suffering for him, right?
Yeah.
He saw the immediate, visceral consequences of poor governance and constant war. Can you give us some of the details that really bring this home, the descriptions that Mencius himself used?
Oh, he describes the misery with breathtaking clarity. He talks about rulers stealing the people's labor during the critical farming seasons, forcing them to neglect their own fields.
So they can't grow their own food.
They can't plow, they can't weed properly, so they can't generate the sustenance they need. The result, he states it plainly, their parents freeze and starve, and siblings, wives, and children are separated. He actually refers to these rulers as essentially drowning their own people.
Drowning them.
Yes, those who sink and drown their people. And consider this other example directed at a Duke Mu of Zhou. Mencius points out that in famine years, sure, the strong may scatter to survive, but the old and weak who are dumped into ditches by the side of the road are numbered in the thousands. And this is all happening while the Duke's own granaries are bursting with food and his treasuries are full. So the problem wasn't a shortage of resources.
It was a shortage of compassion, of justice.
Exactly. Moral horror paired with calculated indifference. That sheer scale of suffering coexisting with abundance and neglect, it must have been overwhelming.
So how did Mencius possibly maintain his mission in the face of all that? What was his answer?
His mission was his response to the chaos. Benevolent governance, or renjing. He believed the solution was simple but profound. Virtue.
It's just virtue.
Just virtue. If rulers governed with compassion and moral integrity, if they lessened arbitrary punishments, reduced oppressive taxes, made sure people had time to farm properly, then order would be restored, both morally and materially. He spent his entire life traveling, trying to advise rulers, believing that this adherence to the way would unlock heaven's support and finally bring a sage king into existence.
Okay, so his political activism and his whole philosophical worldview, they rest entirely on this premise that heaven, Tian, is an active agent. An agent that should be intervening, or at least facilitating intervention.
Yes.
If heaven were just some abstract, indifferent cosmic principle, his mission would be, well, would be pointless.
Absolutely. The foundation of the problem of absence is the expectation of agency. And our sources confirm, there's overwhelming textual evidence that Mencius's heaven is profoundly agential. It is not an impersonal force of nature.
It has a will.
It has a will. Ivanhoe argues that Mencius believed heaven had a specific plan for human beings, that it was conscious of political and moral affairs, interested in them, and intervened directly in how events unfolded.
What's the specific evidence that heaven possesses, that will or intention?
A desire you.
The evidence is explicit. In Mencius 2b13, the very passage we're going to dive into later, heaven is mentioned as being capable of having desires. So if heaven doesn't desire to pacify the world, that implies heaven could desire it.
It has a choice.
It has a choice. And what's more, heaven has this specific active role in the cosmic political cycle. It is responsible for raising up a true king, a sage who will bring order every 500 years. That is a highly specific political obligation with a timeline attached.
And the intervention isn't just on this macro political scale, right? It seems like heaven also interferes pretty dramatically on the micro individual level. It does, and this is where heaven starts looking a bit morally ambiguous, which is vital for the crisis of absence that comes later. Mencius 6b15 describes heaven's intense intervention in preparing great individuals.
How so?
It says, when heaven is about to bestow a great responsibility on a particular person, it will always first subject one's heart and resolution to bitterness, belabor one's muscles and bones, starve one's body and flesh, deprive one's person, and thwart and bring chaos to what one does.
Wait a minute. If heaven is deliberately causing intense suffering, starving the body, causing chaos, thwarting your actions, just for character development, doesn't that make heaven morally ambiguous, almost tyrannical? How's it consistent with a benevolent agent?
That is the ultimate tension within Mencian thought. It's a fascinating paradox. The text suggests this is a form of divine boot camp, a preparation to toughen the spirit and refine the nature.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, kind of thing.
Exactly. It implies a kind of utilitarian benevolence. The suffering is justified by the greatness it eventually produces, the ultimate goal being a sage capable of enduring the immense burdens of leadership. So this view accepts that the divine intention is for the individual to grow stronger through adversity, but you're right, it seriously complicates any simple definition of divine goodness.
Yes.
It's a challenging love.
And that challenging love sets up the emotional reaction we're going to explore, resentment or yuan.
Precisely. If heaven were just a cosmic law, we would talk about frustration or disappointment with fate. But because heaven is this powerful, intentional agent, it is a legitimate target for resentment, for yuan.
So the ideal is not to feel it.
Right. The ethical ideal for the moral gentleman, the Jinzi, is the gentleman is not bitter toward heaven and does not blame others. But the very existence of that warning implies that ordinary virtuous people, and even sages in moments of weakness, are highly capable of feeling resentment when they perceive this agent failing them.
And there are historical examples of this.
For sure. Mencius himself cites the sage king Shen, who, when he was facing great suffering from his wicked family, cried out and wept to heaven. This act of crying to heaven suggests heaven is capable of listening, capable of relationship, and therefore capable of failing or fulfilling its expectations.
So given this intense expectation, let's just solidify what attributes heaven was expected to possess that made its eventual absence so agonizing for Mencius.
We can list 3 core necessary attributes. First, benevolence or care, Ren. While some passages directly attribute Ren to heaven, the strongest argument is through endowment. Heaven gives humans their nature, including the sprout of benevolence.
The giver must possess the gift.
The giver must possess the gift. And one scholar, Li Chen-yang, suggests that in this context, Ren is better understood as a profound care or concern.
And this ties back to that parenting analogy you mentioned.
Yes. The ruler is the son of heaven, and he must rule with benevolence, implying the model heaven is fundamentally benevolent. The ancient odes, which Mencius revered, even use familial terms, stating, "We call thee our father and our mother."
So if heaven is your father and mother, the expectation of care is fundamental. And failing to provide order during chaos would be seen as severe mistreatment or just bad parenting.
Exactly. The second attribute is knowledge. Does heaven know the extent of the suffering?
It has to, right?
It has to. Mencius cites the Book of Documents to assert that heaven sees Shi and hears Xing. Heaven is fully aware of the chaos, the famine, the injustice. It must know when the 500-year cycle requires intervention, and it knows exactly what challenging circumstances to inflict on individuals to toughen their hearts. Total awareness is assumed.
And finally, justice. Does heaven enforce a moral order?
It does, at least partially. Heaven rewards the good, as shown by accepting Shun as worthy of the throne. It also punishes the wicked, typically by allowing their lack of humaneness to lead to population loss or political downfall.
So it's not always a direct thunderbolt from the sky.
No, not at all. And Mencius doesn't believe that material success is the ultimate reward for the morally superior person. The true success is attaining virtue itself. But the expectation remains that heaven will ultimately act to ensure political and moral world order by establishing a sage king.
So to sum up, we have a benevolent, knowledgeable, just, and actively intervening agent operating on a predictable, cyclical timeline. For a follower like Mencius, the expectation of presence is absolute.
Which is what makes the experience of its absence so catastrophic.
We move now to the turning point, the moment this philosophical tension just crystallizes in Mencius 2b13. So Mencius has spent years trying to persuade the rulers of the state of Qi to adopt his benevolent governance.
And he fails.
He fails. He leaves Qi filled with disappointment, and this personal political failure becomes a cosmic crisis.
It does. As he's departing, his disciple, Cheng Yu, observes Mencius's mood. Cheng Yu notes his master's unhappy countenance and immediately challenges him. He asks, essentially, "Master, how can you look so downcast? I heard you teach that the gentleman is not bitter toward heaven and does not blame others."
So the disciple is forcing Mencius to confront the contradiction between his inner feeling and his public moral teaching. This is a huge philosophical challenge. How can a sage, who has supposedly achieved inner harmony, be visibly unhappy?
And Mencius responds not with some simple emotional defense, but with a structural political philosophy argument that justifies his unhappiness. He anchors his expectation in that sacred political cycle. Heaven ought to raise a king every 500 years to bring peace and moral order.
And he does the math.
He does the math for his disciple. He says, "Since the founding of the Zhou dynasty, it has already been more than 700 years. This is more than enough time."
The numbers don't lie. The covenant, the cosmic timeline, is broken. 700 years of increasing chaos, and heaven has failed to send the appointed agent.
Exactly. The world is ripe for correction. The mandated time frame is long past. And Mencius then combines this observation with a remarkable degree of self-assessment. He asks, rhetorically, if the time is right, "Who besides me in the present time is there?" He essentially declares himself the most suitable candidate to be the sage's helper, or maybe even the sage himself.
That's a bold claim.
It's very bold. And then comes the devastating conclusion, the line that summarizes his entire experience of absence. Nonetheless, heaven does not yet desire to pacify the world. And he concludes, Of course I am unhappy.
Wow, that single moment, it reveals what you called a dual absence profile. It's not just a personal career setback.
No.
It's a cosmic event failure.
The profile is crystal clear. First, you have the absence from the world. Heaven has failed to intervene politically, the cycle of order is broken, and chaos reigns globally. Heaven is refusing to fulfill its political obligation to humanity.
And then there's the personal side.
Second, the absence from Mencius. Despite his virtue, his commitment to the way, his readiness to serve, who besides me, Heaven has explicitly withheld the necessary success. It has not desired to pacify the world through him. He is experiencing a profound sense of abandonment by the very agent he trusted to give him the platform he needed to fulfill his life's purpose.
So that makes the suffering both deeply personal and universally applicable. How does this specific Mencian scenario connect back to the generalized profile of divine absence that scholars use today?
It maps perfectly onto the major features that are identified in the scholarship of absence.
Like what?
Well, consider uncertainty. Mencius is baffled. He clearly thought the time was right, and he knew he was the man for the job. His question, who besides me? It's not just boastful. It reflects genuine confusion about Heaven's inscrutable decision-making. He thought he knew the rules of the game, the 500-year cycle, but Heaven, in its silence, is indicating that the rules are more complex, or maybe more unpredictable than he imagined.
And we've already established the sheer magnitude of the evil involved.
Precisely. The feature of horrendous evils or suffering is central here. The suffering Mencius describes, starvation, freezing, abandonment, it's systemic and massive in scale. This just compounds the experience of silence. The divine refusal to intervene in the face of suffering of that magnitude suggests a distance that is nearly unbearable.
And what about the emotional component?
That's the final piece. The feeling of distance or abandonment. Heaven not desiring to pacify the world means Heaven feels distant. And there's an ode Mencius uses elsewhere describing the singer experiencing Heaven as distant. For Mencius, his political failure isn't just bad luck. It's confirmation that the guiding, benevolent agent has, for the time being, abandoned him and the people he's tried to save.
So Mencius is standing in the face of what feels like divine betrayal. A benevolent agent that has the power, has the knowledge, has the timeline, and yet chooses silence and inaction. His crisis is now complete. The question is, how does a sage maintain his integrity in the face of that absence? The moment Mencius' disciple questions his unhappy countenance in 2b13, we are plunged right into the central interpretive divide of Mencian philosophy. Did he resent Heaven, or did he maintain his faith and acceptance? The scholarly stakes here are massive, because the answer really defines what it means to be a true Confucian gentleman, a junzi.
It does, and the complexity of Mencius' final emotional state has led to 3 major interpretive readings of this one passage, all vying to define the limits of sagely behavior.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, there's the non-resentment interpretation. This reading argues that, despite appearances, Mencius was never truly unhappy or resentful. He was merely observing a cosmic fact that Heaven had not yet desired to act, and accepting it with serene resignation. This interpretation prioritizes the ideal of the sage, who maintains perfect inner equilibrium and harmony no matter what's happening externally.
Then we have the diachronic interpretation.
This view sees Mencius as momentarily human. He was temporarily resentful or distraught when he first made the calculation about the 700 years. But critically, the rest of the conversation, which often involves a broader discussion of the way, served to talk him out of that resentment. His initial unhappiness was real, but he eventually accepted his lot over time. It shows a process of moral self-cultivation leading away from resentment.
And the third, most challenging possibility.
The resentment interpretation. This holds that Mencius was, in fact, resentful against Heaven. This resentment, Yuan, is only possible because he views Heaven as a moral agent that failed to fulfill its moral and historical obligations. This reading is powerful because it takes Mencius' unhappiness at face value and forces us to recognize the profound disappointment that comes with the failure of the way.
Let's spend a minute on that word, Yuan, resentment. Why is resentment toward Heaven such a powerful ethical challenge for a Confucian scholar, and what does it imply about Heaven itself?
Well, resentment, Yuan, it isn't mere annoyance. It implies the target has wronged you. For a junzi, the moral gentleman, the goal is inner harmony and independence from external validation. Resenting Heaven, the ultimate source of order and moral endowment, means the junzi is allowing external failure, the lack of political success, to corrupt their internal state.
It's a loss of moral sovereignty.
That's a perfect way to put it. The ideal sage should accept what they cannot control. Resentment implies the sage is still demanding a specific outcome from the cosmos, violating the fundamental principle of accepting heaven's mandate. So, the very presence of resentment, even if it's temporary, it signifies a moral struggle and validates the view that heaven is a moral agent capable of ethical failing in human eyes.
So if resentment is the emotional protest against the absence, what is the Confucian answer to that protest? That has to be faith. Let's focus on the synthesis provided by Neo-Confucianism, particularly Zhu Xi.
Right. Zhu Xi, centuries later, he provided the definitive faith interpretation. He argued that Mencius was harmonizing the painful, immediate thoughts of distress about the world with a more enduring, long-term faith which delights in heaven. So while Mencius appeared unhappy, Zhu Xi insisted he was never unhappy because his faith superseded his momentary disappointment.
And this sounds like faith is just, inextricably linked to the concept of man-fate or mandate.
It is the ultimate expression of Ming. Kuang-Loi Shun defines Ming as the attitude of acceptance toward occurrences that go against one's personal wishes, that one attaches great significance to, but which one cannot alter without acting improperly or undermining one's virtue.
So for Mencius, failing to secure political success was a massive personal disappointment.
Huge. But he could not force heaven's hand without compromising his moral integrity. He had to accept his Ming.
This acceptance highlights a crucial normative dilemma. Mencius, the virtuous person, thought heaven ought to intervene and raise a king right now.
Right.
But heaven did not.
That's the crux. The crisis is a conflict between the human moral understanding of heaven's duty and heaven's actual present decision. And in this conflict, the sage must, as a matter of principle, side with heaven's Ming, its ultimate actual decision, rather than insisting on his own interpretation of the cosmic timeline or heaven's obligations.
So faith is a kind of resilient commitment.
It's an enduring faith. Mencius accepted that he was not the chosen king, but he did not abandon the Confucian way. He continued his mission of moral persuasion, trusting that heaven would eventually bring order, even if the method, the timing, or the agent himself remained unknown. This faith is resilient. It continues even in the face of all this counter-evidence.
Let's delve a little deeper into the mechanism of that faith, using the contemporary distinction between faith that and faith in.
We can certainly map these ideas onto Mencius's response. So first, you have faith that heaven will bring order. This is the propositional belief that heaven has an ultimate, if currently hidden, plan. When Mencius accepts heaven's Ming, he is essentially saying, I believe that heaven, the benevolent agent, has a sufficient reason for this action or inaction, even though those reasons are completely beyond my current understanding.
That immediately sounds like a non-Western echo of skeptical theism. Can you walk us through that comparison?
The parallel is striking. Skeptical theism in Western philosophy of religion argues that even if God exists, human beings are not necessarily in a position to evaluate God's moral reasons for permitting evil or for being hidden. God may have morally sufficient reasons that just exceed our limited human comprehension.
Okay.
Mencius's acceptance of summing acts in a similar way. He doesn't claim to know why heaven failed to raise the king, but he trusts that heaven has a plan, or at least a reason, for withholding its desire to pacify the world now. The limits of human knowledge regarding divine motivation justify the continued faith.
And what about the deeper emotional commitment, the faith in?
That's the commitment to trust. It is faith in heaven's ultimate benevolence and trustworthiness, or, and this is key, faith in the intrinsic value of the Confucian way itself. This is tied directly to another passage, Mencius 7a9, where the ultimate reward for the moral person is not political success, but the attainment of virtue and righteousness.
So if the goal is virtue, the failure to secure a political platform is merely incidental.
Exactly. The true success moral integrity remains within the Junzi's control, regardless of what heaven does or doesn't do.
Now, we have to address the most complex possibility, the synchronic interpretation. You're arguing that it's possible, maybe even necessary, for Mencius to feel genuine resentment and maintain faith at the same time. That sounds completely counterintuitive.
It's paradoxical, but I think it's philosophically coherent. The argument is that these are two different modes of experience operating concurrently. Resentment, Yuan, is the immediate, painful, emotional protest stemming from the experience of absence, the failure of heaven to meet the moral obligation in the short term. Faith, Yuan, however, is the long-term intellectual and ethical commitment. It's the rational decision to remain open to heaven acting in an unknown way, and the commitment to the value of the way itself.
So, the deeper the trust, the greater the potential for betrayal, and therefore the greater the ability to resent the agent. Walk us through that mechanism.
Precisely. If Mencius viewed heaven as some cold, indifferent force, he would only feel frustration, not resentment. Resentment requires a perceived moral failing by a moral agent, because Mencius had such deep, profound faith in a benevolent, agential heaven, because he believed so completely in the cosmic contract that guaranteed the 500-year cycle. That very faith created an expectation that was sky high.
So when heaven failed to fulfill that obligation,
The necessary condition for profound, agonizing resentment was met. The betrayal is only felt because the trust was so complete.
that's a fascinating way to look at it.
It's a sophisticated analysis that honors both the emotional reality of human disappointment and the required moral tenacity of the sage. Mencius is human, he's unhappy, but his ultimate moral commitment to the way his faith remains unbroken. His resentment is evidence of his high moral expectation, not a total abandonment of his faith.
This detailed analysis of Mencius offers a profound challenge to how the problem of divine absence is usually discussed in, philosophy departments.
Yeah.
What's the immediate contemporary implication of the Mencian case?
Well, the first major takeaway is that it broadens the scope of the problem. The Mencian experience proves that the crisis of divine absence is not exclusive to monotheistic traditions that revolve around an omnigod.
Right.
The problem arises in any tradition where a devout person expects the presence of a caring, agential deity or entity and experiences silence in the face of suffering. This framework is transferable across cultures and different conceptions of the divine.
So that makes it a powerful cross-cultural bridge for philosophical inquiry, allowing us to move beyond specific Western theological constraints.
Absolutely. The experience of the caregiver being hidden, failing to respond to cries, abandoning the cared for, that's a universal spiritual stress point. By showing that the problem is robust, even without the criteria of omnipotence or omnibenevolence in the constant sense, we strip the problem down to its essential component: relational failure between an agent and its devotee.
And this brings us to what might be the most powerful cross-cultural insight: the critique of Western assumptions about divine love and care, specifically around this idea of availability.
Right. The problem of hiddenness, as argued by Schellenberg, it really hinges on the premise that a perfectly loving God would ensure non-resistant belief exists. But Helen de Cruz and other scholars have noted that this premise is likely heavily influenced by contemporary Western cultural intuitions.
Like what?
Specifically, the expectation of a loving parent being constantly available and responsive to their child's needs.
The idea that love requires constant, immediate availability. That is a deeply ingrained cultural intuition. But Mencius gives us the perfect countermodel.
He provides the opposite extreme, and the contrast is profound. Mencius's expectation was that a benevolent heaven only needed to intervene once every 500 years by raising a king to reset the global moral and political order. That was heaven's duty to humanity. In the intervening centuries, the expectation was that humans should rely on their innate moral sprouts and the teachings of the sages.
So the distinction is that Western frameworks often assume that divine love requires constant presence or communication to maintain faith and prevent suffering.
Yes, whereas the Mencian framework suggests that divine care is demonstrated through cyclical intervention and moral endowment.
So if heaven's duty is only to intervene once every 5 centuries, then its silence over, say, 100 years is not necessarily a sign of neglect.
No.
It's just the expected temporary condition of that specific kind of relationship. The absence is simply the default state.
Exactly. And this forces us to question the philosophical weight of our own cultural assumptions. If our definition of a loving deity demands constant availability, we are implicitly inserting a specific, culturally derived model of a parental relationship into what's supposed to be universal philosophy. The Mencian model, which prioritizes cyclical order and human moral self-sufficiency in the interim, demonstrates that a caring agent might operate on a completely different, much grander timescale of intervention.
And if the divine operates on a 500-year cycle, what happens to human responsibility in the meantime?
That is the fundamental philosophical challenge. If heaven is absent by design for long periods, human moral responsibility becomes paramount. Mencius' failure in key forces him and his followers to recognize that even if heaven has reasons for its silence, its Ming, the responsibility to pursue Renjeng benevolent governance remains a human one.
So it puts the onus back on us.
It does. And this contrast compels contemporary philosophers to consider how non-Western concepts of care and relationship, which might emphasize duty, timing, and moral self-cultivation over constant emotional responsiveness, might fundamentally reframe the arguments about divine love and hiddenness. It expands the possibilities for what a good or caring divine agent might even look like.
It makes us realize that we are importing these deeply specific cultural assumptions even when we try to define ostensibly universal concepts like love or care.
Yeah.
Mencius teaches us that divine care can be demonstrated through periodic architecture, the cycle, rather than constant maintenance or availability.
And that lesson is invaluable for developing a truly cross-cultural philosophy of religion.
Wow, what a profound and deeply detailed exploration. We moved from the visceral chaos of the Warring States period, established the highly agential and demanding nature of Mencius's heaven, a deity with specific political obligations, and then analyzed his intellectual and emotional response to its failure to intervene when the cosmic timeline demanded it.
The core insight we uncovered today, I think, lies in that complex interplay of faith and resentment. Mencius's enduring faith, his decision to accept heaven's banging, the final, ultimate decision of the cosmos, is not a simple resignation. It's the highest act of sageliness. It demonstrates an unconditional commitment to the Confucian way. By continuing to prioritize virtue over material success, he proved that his dedication was independent of heaven's immediate political support.
This decision to stay the course, in the face of immense suffering and profound divine absence, leads us with a final provocative thought for you to carry forward.
If the ultimate reward for the morally superior person, the true success, is not material or political, it's not the king's platform, but the attainment of virtue and moral integrity itself, as Mencius explicitly taught in 7a9. Does the experience of profound divine absence actually become a necessary and refining catalyst for achieving that true moral strength? If the divine only intervenes every 500 years, and every personal effort to achieve political success is thwarted, doesn't that absence act as a final, necessary test, forcing the Junzi to commit to the way purely for the way's sake? Something to chew on as you consider the nature of commitment in the face of silence.